This is not a lecture, actually. We could spend 6 months and a year maybe discussing this topic. This is not something that we can cover, either you or I, in conversation in an hour. This should be a conversation that we have consistently, because we are weak. The left globally is extraordinarily weak. And we need to ask serious questions about the nature of our weakness. There is an important Guinea-Bissau Marxist leader who in the 1960s and 70s led his country to independence. His name is Amilcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau in Western Africa. And Amilcar Cabral, in one of his texts that he wrote, said, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories." Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Our movement has to be honest and sober about its strength, its weakness, its possibilities, the obstacles before it. There's no point lying to each other about our strength, our possibilities. At the same time, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. At the same time, the worst reaction to sober thinking is complete defeat, is to walk away from it all, to feel completely annihilated by reality, to say to yourself, things like revolution are impossible. You know, a lot of people on the left have decided to suspend talk of revolution because they say the time is not right. But the fact is that we are 1 year from the anniversary of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And in 1914 and 15, only a handful of revolutionaries believed in a certain point of view, which is that a revolution was possible. I mean, earlier in the 20th century, Rosa Luxemburg attacked Eduardo Bernstein because Bernstein had written a book called Evolutionary Socialism, arguing that a revolution is not possible, it's not on the cards, and that capitalist society will evolve into socialism by itself. And what a Marxist movement must do is help it in its evolution. And Rosa Luxemburg wrote a terrific attack at Bernstein called Reform and Revolution, where she argued that capitalism is not capable, she demonstrated capitalism is not capable of evolving into socialism. Capitalism is only capable of crisis and recovery. And it is the opportunities afforded by capitalism's turbulence and its impossibility to evolve that the socialist has to argue their program. Hence, she said, it's a choice between socialism and barbarism. Barbarism is the natural state. Capitalism will evolve into barbarism. It's socialism that is its antidote. So at the same time as we have to be sober and say, look, we are weak. We have to admit to ourselves there is weakness on the global level. As you said, the far right has gained. The extreme center has gained. You know, the neoliberals have gained. We are weak. We are suffering defeats in too many places. At the same time as we recognize that, we should not go into defeatism. Say that revolution is impossible, annihilate our own ideology. We have to be both honest and at the same time hopeful, which is why Gramsci borrowed that slogan from Romain Rolland. Romain Rolland was a liberal writer who wrote, I think, a book on Gandhi as well. And Rolland had a slogan where he said, optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect, which Gramsci borrows. And I think that slogan, which we hear off and on, is really a representation of our place, the dialectical representation of our thinking in this reality. On the one side, we should honestly look at reality and say we are weak and we need to study our weakness. Why are we weak? At the same time, we have to be optimistic about our possibilities, because if we are not optimistic, the future is barbarism. In that sense, socialism is the antidote to reality. So we have to maintain our revolutionary commitment to transformation. And I'm afraid across the global left, people have stopped talking about revolution. Even in India, our leaders don't talk often about revolutionary change, the need to understand that the solution is not in the present. The solution is in the future we will create. Okay, so you understand, I'm talking now in that space between pessimism and optimism. They are both present. Don't fall for one over the other. Don't be overly hopeful. Then you'll bang your head against reality. don't be overly pessimistic because we'll all be dead. Because reality will essentially kill us all. So we have to bounce between the two. Now, this morning I had a piece in the Hindu, which is on a ceasefire in Colombia, where the FARC, the major Marxist communist movement, which had been fighting an armed struggle against the Colombian state since the 1960s. It's the longest and most bloody war in Latin America that has been continuously fought from the 1960s till now. The FARC and the government of Santos in Colombia met in Cuba from 2012 till last week, and they signed a ceasefire. This is the most significant event. By the way, this bloody ceasefire was signed the same day as the Brexit, which is why you never heard about it. Because all we are interested in is what's happening in Europe. Because colonialism ended 60 years ago, but our brains are still colonized. We are still interested in what's happening with Britain. We don't care what's happening with Colombia. Nobody reads the news, what's going on over there. It's a very significant event that the Colombian civil war has come to an end. Now, I interviewed the negotiating team from FARC, and I said to one of them, how can you be sure that the Colombian government, which is fully backed by the Americans through something called Plan Colombia, how can you be sure that the Colombian government is going to honor its agreement? Because in the 1980s, when you came above ground and ran for elections, the security forces executed 2,500 of your cadre, and you went back to the forest. How can you be sure today that the events of 1986 will not be repeated? And she said to me, we are sure because now in Latin America, there are left forces around us that will keep an eye, this was the phrase used, they will keep an eye on what's happening in Colombia. So I said to her, what do you mean left forces? In Brazil, there was a coup d'etat. The government of Dilma was thrown out by an essentially fascistic group of thugs who, with using a monopoly media company called Globo, which owns about 40 to 50% of Brazilian airspace, radio, etc., TV, conducted a coup against the government. What left are you talking about? In Venezuela, within a few years, the government is going to be voted out. It is under immense strain. Don't fantasize about Chavez. This is a different period. In Argentina, a bankrupt-minded conservative leader, Macri, defeated the heir of the Peronists in an election which the Peronists should have won, but they picked the worst candidate to lead them to the polls. Sometimes that makes a difference. You know, there's a difference between Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. Hugo Chavez is an incredibly charismatic person. In a democratic society, who leads you to the polls makes a big difference. We may be Marxists, we may believe that history is through masses and structures, but don't underestimate the power of who's leading you. It makes a big difference. Because after all, we live in a telegenic age, and Maduro is nothing compared to Chavez. So in Argentina, they lost a closely fought election. What left are you talking about? In Ecuador, the government is under threat. There's no guarantee that the government of Korea is going to last, the next couple of years. Maybe Bolivia they'll last, but even Bolivia, there's immense pressure against the Mas government. So who knows what the situation is? In Honduras, there was a coup d'etat in 2009, and last year, a very beloved, indigenous activist against dams was executed in a house. Perhaps by people who backed the coup under the green light from Hillary Clinton's State Department. So what left are you talking about? And she said, no, there are left forces in Latin America that are still there. This is a different period than the 1980s. The MST, the Movement Sintera in Brazil, is still active. People are still active in Mexico, even though they can't have an electoral breakthrough. So the left is alive, she said. I was doubtful when I was interviewing her. I said that let's not exaggerate this. She said it's still alive. But that gives us some sense of surety, but we are not blind. We are going to maintain our ability to take care of our people if the violence starts again. So why begin there? Why begin there? Because we have to understand that even in South America, even in Latin America, where there was a breakthrough against neoliberalism in the 1990s, there are setbacks, major setbacks. If you look in Africa, there are deep setbacks against the left. The South African Communist Party has made a big mistake by staying yoked to the African National Congress. Their own base has disappeared. They made a big mistake. The situation is grave there because COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which is the main arm of the communist movement in South Africa, is split. The most militant unions, Mine Workers Union and others, have broken away from the left flank, and they are challenging the alliance in power from the left, which is, in a way, it's a healthy thing. But this weakens everybody until they are able to build their strength. So even South Africa, there's a great difficulty in assuming that the left is going to have some power. It's true that in Africa earlier this year, there was the first African left parties conference in Lusaka, Zambia. But if you look at the list of parties that came, they're small. The party that came from Egypt, for instance, Peace and Bread and Freedom, is a tiny party, in comparison to what they need to have an influence in Egypt. These are tiny groups. These are not big groups. Africa, there is great weakness. Asia, what can I say? Whole of West Asia is in turmoil. The space for the left is minimal. People in West Asia at most will wish for a liberal outcome to the bloodletting. The space for a revolution is non-existent there. In the rest of Asia, let's not, again, go a little crazy about Russia. The Russian government is not a left government. The Russian government of Vladimir Putin is not a left government. It is a government of the right center that is directly challenging, for its own geostrategic reasons, Washington, D.C. That doesn't make it, because it's challenging Washington, D.C., that doesn't make it a government of the left. It's a government of the right center. The communists in Russia are making a reappearance, but they are nowhere near strength. They are weak. They are weakened even more now because Putin has become so strong. He takes his shirt off, he wrestles with a bear. This kind of macho politics, nobody should assume it's the left, please. In our left, we don't want our leaders to ride on horses bareback. That is without a shirt and say, I'm stronger, I'll eat you. And that's not the politics of my left. Our left is a left that has sympathy and empathy for other people. It's not a macho left. We have no interest in that. So don't be misunderstood by it. Just because Putin is in a geostrategic challenge to the United States doesn't make it left. Across the rest of Asia, let's not even start a discussion on China because that's a waste of time. Okay, that's got its own complexities. They are in the middle of whatever the hell they are in the middle of. Nobody really has a clear idea what's going on in China. And we can debate this for days on end. I'm sure many of you do. Blue in the face. Somebody saying, no, it's continuing to be socialist, comrade, because so much of the productive forces are controlled by the state. What a level to have the discussion at, by the way. Such a mechanical level to discuss what socialism is. I recommend that you go and read Marx's economic and political manuscripts, which perhaps we should publish in the next couple of years in a good edition, economic and political manuscripts. Socialism is to make human beings human. That's what socialism is about. And part of making human beings human is that we don't live in the realm of necessity, where we are starving, without a house. Those things are important. But socialism isn't just about having a house and having a full belly. You have to feel like a human being. And I'm afraid if our measure of socialism is merely how much of the productive forces is owned by the state, then we become mechanical in our thinking. Because socialism for us is when people are able to look at each other and say, you are a human being, I am a human being, I recognize you for yourself. And I'm not a humanist. I'm a Marxist and a communist, and that's how I define socialism. I don't define socialism merely in a mechanical way. We have to define it also in the cultural sense. Okay, we are weak. How do we get strong again and why did we, the other way around. How did we get weak and how do we get strong again? Or why did we get weak? How did we get strong again? No point going back and saying, let's learn the lessons of the 19th century. Look, when Marx analyzed capitalism in Capital, Volume 1. How many of you read Capital, Volume 1? Very good. We read it together, that too. Close to is there. Half, who said half? That's, you see, half. That's like having half a night's sleep. It's not complicated. Was it complicated? It's one of the best, lucidest books if you read it without being scared of it. If you come at it saying, oh my God, I'm going to read Marx, it's intimidating, you'll never get past the first chapter. If you think that this book is about economics, you'll never be able to read it. This is not a book of economics. This is a book about human reality. It's a critique of the system we live in. It's not economics. If you read the first chapter and think the chapter on commodities is a chapter on economics, you've lost it, pals. You'll never read it again. You'll be so scared. That first chapter is a chapter on philosophy. It's a chapter on how to understand the atom of the system. Anyway, you read it. But in Capital, Marx makes an interesting observation and a discovery. That is, he lays out fully a discovery he made some years before, which is that the mode of accumulation in a capitalist society, and Capital is not an ideal typical portrayal of capitalism. Capital is a book which analyzes capitalism of that moment, with England as his example because he had the materials before him, because he was based in London. I don't agree with people who say it's actually a model of capitalism. No, it's actually an assessment of the capitalism of his day, and why I'm saying that will become important in a few minutes. He made a discovery that the nature of capitalist accumulation pushed capital, that is this agglomeration of wealth which is used to make more wealth, that's the definition of capital. This capital sought after profit, and the direction of development of social productive forces moved towards consolidation of production. That's one thing. Big gargantuan factories, what he and others call centralization of capital. And secondly, because if you centralize capital and want to take care of your competition, you'll try to find any means to make your products cheaper. That's what it is, not efficient, cheaper. In order to cheapen the production cost of your per unit commodity, you are going to use several strategies. One strategy is to make labor work longer. That's the section on the working day. The other one is to substitute labor with a machine. That's the section of the machinery section. So what Marx discovered is capitalism of the 19th century went for gargantuan factories where they accumulated people and bought these people as labor power. That means they came and sold their labor power. And capital relied on labor in the human form, which had been sold as labor power, because this is not slavery. You sell so many hours of your work. Capital relied on those people to make the commodities. And because capital had centralized itself to such a great extent, if the socialists organized the workers in unions, then they would have power over capital. That's the direct class struggle being intensified. Because the class struggle already existed when they hired workers to work for them. But when you organize a union, the class struggle intensifies. And a strike, which is a term that comes from pirates. To strike the sails means to bring the sails down of a ship. You strike the sails, and mutinies on the high sea, they struck their sails. You stop work. You strike the power cord and say, we will not work. You block capital. And Marx understood that capital cannot stop moving. It's like mercury. If you stop capital, if you constipate capital, the capitalist is forever losing money. They rely on constant movement of capital. So a strike traps capital and gives workers power over the system. That was Marx's understanding of why unions were important in the 19th century. And it was based on that analysis that the trade union movement has a theory in the latter part of the 19th century. Okay, trade union movement picks up. First Working Men's Association meets in London in 1864. This is just before Capital is published in 1867, and Marx is in the chair. He pushes this theory that the Working Men's Association has to organize unions in factories where the strike is a major weapon of the workers. In 1871, when the Paris Commune emerges, Marx gets confidence that the Paris Commune is the demonstration of the workers' innate political abilities to take control of cities and countries and things like that. When the Paris Commune is crushed in 1872, in Marx's new preface to the Communist Manifesto, which I think you should read the 1872 preface to the Communist Manifesto, Marx writes, "We have not changed the language of the manifesto written in 1848. We haven't changed the language because this is now a historical document. But in 1872, we have to recognize we are in a moment of defeat. We have to think again about our strategy." It's a very important text. I'm going to jump forward because I'm skipping how Lenin brings to this tradition the importance of the peasantry. I'm going to skip all that. How Mao also brings to this tradition peasantry. We don't have time for all that. Let's go straight to our present moment. 40 years ago, capital changed the nature of its accumulation strategy. Instead of gargantuizing production, capitalism has disarticulated production. And I'll explain that in a minute. Instead of needing to build giant factories where enormous numbers of workers concentrate together, and therefore you can build a union there, and therefore when the union strikes, circuits of capital shut down. You understand? That's the 19th century to the 1970s. From the 70s onwards, capital has changed its strategy. It now operates in a different way. And its shift in strategy is what has destroyed the reservoirs of the left, which is working class power. Why have unions deteriorated? Not because trade unionists are working less hard today, but because the material conditions in which unions have to work are completely altered. Until we come to terms with that, we won't understand our weakness. So what has happened to the nature of accumulation and production? See, we use the phrase, we are now in the era of finance capital. Listen, we can't eat finance. This is not made only by finance. Things are produced. We have to also look at accumulation strategies. We need good empirical studies. Let me give you a sense of the same model I produced from capital. Let me give you a model from the 70s onwards. Several important points need to be considered, premises for the switch. The first important premise is that new technological breakthroughs come up. The first technological breakthrough, which is very important, is computerization. Because what the computer does is it enables a firm to keep real-time inventories. Okay, so just try to remember the sequence of things I'm going to talk about because they're all related. It's impossible for me to tell all of them in one line. So these are all bricks building a wall, surrounding me, protecting me from your questions. So brick one is, okay, that there is computerization which enables the creation of accurate, to-the-moment databases, which you couldn't do before because when you write things out, it takes time to check. So it cuts down the time for database management. Okay, that's one. Second thing is, satellites are flying around the world. That means that the database can be global. If you have a database in Vietnam, that database in real time can be linked to a database in India. So not only is the database itself, computerization, enable you to create a up-to-the-minute database. So in time, the database is compressed. Time is compressed for the database. When the moment you enter it, everybody in your area can see it, right? So time is compressed. But space also gets compressed in this database. Because as you enter data in Vietnam, you can read it in India. And that's what's made possible by satellites. Previously, it took time because space, what is space? Space is also time. If you are 100 miles away, it takes time to get information there. But if you compress space and time, the time-space compression is not quantum mechanics I'm talking about. This is business theory. So when I'm talking about time-space compression, I'm not saying that time-space continuum is warping. I'm not a weirdo. This is business theory. Okay? So the database now is operating essentially simultaneously across time and space. Third thing that happens, which is extraordinarily important, is that oil prices, after the defeat of the second oil war, Cold War in oil in 1979, oil prices begin to not necessarily stay high, because they don't, but they stabilize. Previously there was great fluctuation in oil prices. Oil prices start to stabilize. And they stabilize on the low end. They're not very high, not like 1973, 79. They come down. Some of this is political because the Saudis become reliable weapons against OPEC. Saudis always betray OPEC. From 79 onwards, they betray OPEC. So transportation costs come down. Number 4, shipping has an enormous breakthrough in containerization. Previously, when a ship pulled into the port, it took 2-3 days to unload the ship. Now these giant tankers can pull into a port in China and be emptied in hours, because all the goods are in containers. Cranes, huge cranes, grab them, put them on the back of a truck or put them on a train, and the container does not have to be emptied at all. So the time and cost of transportation declines deeply. This is the 4th thing that happens. The 5th thing that happens is because of the Third World debt crisis in 1979, 80, 81, 82, that debt crisis whose effects still are with us, countries of the global south are weakened, deeply weakened. Their political will is broken. And they all start to, under IMF pressure, etc., tell the global capital flows, we want to be good to you. That means we politically are not willing to challenge you like we might have earlier. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Linked to this, the West pushes through the Uruguay round at the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the last round of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which becomes the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The West pushes a theory of intellectual property, which says that no longer is the process patented. Previously, the process used to be patented. So if you could find a different process to make a pharmaceutical drug, you could do it. It was not illegal. In the last GATT round, which enters the WTO, they changed the patent law to product patent. So you can't reverse engineer a drug and find a new way to make it. Because if the product is patented, you are obliged to pay rent to the patent holder. This is a very important part. These 2 points are very important. The point of weakened political will in the global south and the new patent regime. Now what happens because of all this is you don't need to build a giant factory that makes cars in one country. You could take that giant factory and build it over 5 or 6 countries. One country makes tires, one country makes the chassis, one country makes the body, one country makes the seats, and the final country assembles the car. You see, what this does politically to workers is it disarms them. This is called the global commodity chain. And it's a terribly anemic term, which makes everything seem horizontal. It's actually a vertical chain, it's not horizontal. Because some people have power in this system over others. 2 of the major weapons of workers in the global south are immediately invalidated by this new structure of accumulation. One is the strike. You see, if you are at a factory that makes car tires and you go on strike, the global commodity chain says goodbye. Because now we are moving to another country just to make tires. Previously, if you went on strike, you shut down production of the whole car. Capital was trapped. Now capital says, anyway, this factory is controlled by a subcontractor. We don't care. We are just going to source our tires from somewhere else. Now, what happens is, labor is told by management we are in the same boat as you, management. We are also in a difficult boat. So we should be partners. You should take a wage cut. You should work harder. You should not create a union. You're creating problems for yourself and for me, because we'll just go out of business. So the first important, most important weapon of the 19th century, the strike, working class factory-based strike, becomes much harder. Doesn't disappear, becomes much harder. As you well know in your own experience, you see this happen all the time. Workers have a hard time going on strike, creating unions, etc. Union density collapses not because trade unionists are not working hard, but the structure in which they are operating is transformed now. Second major weapon that the workers' movement used was nationalization. If you took power in the government, if your workers' parties seized the government, then the government could nationalize the factory. But listen, your factory that you're working at makes toothpaste tubes. Another country is making the toothpaste. You nationalize the toothpaste tube factory, you're still at the mercy of the so-called global commodity chain. What better deal are you able to get for anybody? At most, you cut out the subcontractor. And the state then is the subcontractor in the global commodity chain. And the state then will start to basically become the subcontractor of capital. So nationalization of a strategy is also very difficult now. It's very hard to nationalize a factory if it's only part of a global commodity chain. This is a huge structural shift. Now, because this is an enormous structural shift, the nature of imperialism is also altered a little bit. See, earlier, imperialism was partly driven by the desire of monopoly capital to struggle against other fractions of monopoly capital, and sometimes couched itself in the flag of its country to move towards inter-imperialist wars, correct? That's what basically one crude way of talking about Leninism, is that imperialism is not necessarily a global, one monolithic structure. There can be different fractions of imperialism that confront each other. After all, Lenin's pamphlet is written in response to World War I, how to explain World War I. You know, is there one imperialist hegemon, or are there fractions that battle each other, etc.? It doesn't matter. Point is that there are monopoly capitals that can utilize the flag and nationalism in ways that create instability and push for their own agenda against others, and sell their products, steal resources at, basically super profit prices they're selling, and they buy at sub-minimal costs, right? Now it's slightly different, which is where the United States military comes in. Now the importance of imperialism is also in protection. To protect the disarticulated nature of production. So what becomes important? Managing shipping lanes. And India has become entirely subordinated in this. Joint naval exercises with the United States Navy to so-called to make interoperability of the two naval forces, to make sure, under the guise of fighting piracy, that the West's alliance controls the straits of Indonesia, from the South China Sea all the way out to the southern part of India, the Indian Ocean. So the Singapore Navy, now even the Indonesian Navy, Indian Navy, and the US Navy conduct exercises all the time in this region. They are patrolling the high seas. They are putting pressure on other so-called competitors like China. Another thing is the fight against piracy of goods, to maintain the integrity of intellectual property, to use extra economic force against countries to make sure that they pay rents on the goods that they are selling. So China is always getting in the neck from the United States for piracy, crack down on piracy. Third, use of extra economic force to make these subordinate countries, including China, revalue their currency to the benefit of global capital. Twice this happened to Japan in the 1980s. Once in 1980s and 1990s. Once in the Plaza Accord in 1985 and in the Reverse Plaza Accord in 1995. Twice Japan shifted its currency to benefit global capital. And this is what they're trying to do with China. Use extra economic force, pressure, political pressure to make the Chinese value their currency to their detriment. Whichever way it goes, whether to make it more expensive or to cheapen it. So imperialism today is functioning at a different level. It's not necessarily about going to war with countries. It's using a massive economic and military power of the West, but especially the United States military power, to subordinate any challenge to this order, this system. And precisely because the reservoirs of worker power have been depleted, the challenge to imperialism on a global scale has not been mounted. You'll notice that despite the fact that many occasions there has been an attempt to create a new international. Last time was Chavez wanting to create the fifth international. There's no appetite for it. Because partly, who's got the resources to manage an international if you can barely manage the struggle in your own country? No country has the resources. In Venezuela, they don't have the resources. They are fighting a rearguard action against the right wing inside their country. Who's going to create a secretariat that manages, the global coordination of struggles against imperialism? So this weakness that we have is not a weakness of, oh, people are not working hard enough, or they have made this bad strategic decision or that bad. You see, you're sitting with you're driving a car, leaning right into the windscreen, looking at every piece of dirt on the windscreen. Oh, why did you make this decision? That's why we have failed. Why did you make this? That's why we have failed. I'm saying, pull back. Take the bigger picture. Around the world, the left is in disarray. Why? We need to rebuild the reservoirs of working class strength. It's hard to build them in factories. Therefore, some of the main opportunities provided in the last 20 years have been to build working class strength elsewhere. Very quick detour, and I'm going to tell that story and then we can discuss. You see, the point of a communist movement or a left movement is not to build trade unions. I mean, Lenin had written a pamphlet against economism. The point isn't to build trade unions. The point is to build a socialist society. Trade unionism is an important and essential arsenal of a socialist struggle. But it's not the only way. The point is to build worker strength and worker confidence, the other way around, confidence and strength. Whether you build worker confidence and strength at the workplace or anywhere else is not actually important. If you're able to build worker strength in the factory and unions, go ahead, do it. But if that's difficult, look around and see where else can we build worker strength. Very interesting, in Bolivia, when they were at the weakest part of their struggle in the 1990s, and the trade unions were in serious crisis in Bolivia, the water battle broke out in the town of Cochabamba. And in Cochabamba, what happened was they privatized water supply and the rates rose enormously. There was a lot of frustration in the town, and there had been some sporadic actions against municipal buildings. People go and throw a brick. You can't throw a brick and make a revolution, even though throwing a brick through a window sometimes is a useful tool. It's not itself going to change anything. The trade union, so there's a story in Bolivia which doesn't, the trade union federation in Cochabamba was headed by Oscar Olivares. He was a trade union, very experienced trade unionist. The entire trade union federation said, we have to get involved in the water struggle. And Olivares became the leader of the water fight. Now, later, when books are written about Bolivia, they say Oscar Olivares, the coordinator of the water war. Because guess what happened, people? People were upset. They were so upset by the raise in price, they just decided to protest, and they randomly created a leadership, and leadership randomly chose Olivares, and he somehow miraculously knew exactly what to do, and they won the battle of against privatization. That's what they want to tell you. It's a spontaneous thing. It's civics, you know. What happens is civics. You stand up, do a dharna, and say, we oppose corruption. And then people come and they sit, and somehow they say, wow, you are a leader because you are such a great guy. You oppose corruption. Let's all oppose corruption. And suddenly there's a revolution. That's the theory that they want you to think is how it happened in Bolivia. But actually, these were seasoned trade unionists who had experience building a movement. They knew what to do. They knew how to protect the people from the police, for instance. When you go to struggle against the state, you're going to get attacked by the police. You have to defend the people. You have to know how to build the ramparts of defense. So these people built the movement. Now, what was unique about them is they didn't sit at the gates of the factory and say, let's keep trying to build a union here. Because the material structure of possibility there had declined. So they went where the temperature was high and they built a major movement. That Cochabamba War becomes an important component in Evo Morales' movement for socialism, MAS. And then they translate that into electoral victory. What I'm saying is that our movements need to realize that capitalism still needs workers. It cannot make a profit merely through the banks. But it has devised a strategy that has made it almost impossible for states to nationalize factories, if we take political power, and made it almost impossible for workers to build union at the point of production. Because if you do, they close the factory down. But they still need workers. And they're impoverishing workers. Workers have to live somewhere. Workers have to drink something. Workers have to eat something. Workers have to find a place to educate their children. A socialist movement today, I would argue, needs to build its reservoirs where the workers live. We need to be in bastis. We need to be in favelas. We need to be in slums. We as socialists need to build worker power where workers live. This is not to say you don't build unions. This is a complementary strategy. It's that you don't just believe that at the gates of the factory, revolutions start alone. Revolutions can start when 20 women decide to march down the street and say, today is March 8th. Did you know that, by the way? Did you know that the Russian Revolution begins on March 8th, when the women went out on a march to celebrate March 8th, and then first women came out of factories and joined the march, and then men joined them, and that's the beginning of the Russian Revolution. It starts on March 8th, 1917, on International Women's Day. Women begin that revolution because they are fighting to honor the struggles of working women around the world that day in Russia. That was the beginning of, and I hope next year when we celebrate the Russian Revolution, we don't celebrate it as a revolution of men, because we'll forget the essence of what that revolution really was. It starts on March 8th, 1917. It doesn't start when Lenin storms the Winter Palace. Lenin is sitting in Switzerland when it begins. These workers go on a march, a certain dynamism opens up, and then the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, SRs, etc. come and join the struggle, and they give it shape and leadership. So, the revolution doesn't necessarily start at the factory gate. It can start in somebody's house when they are frustrated that today the water hasn't come, or they are frustrated we haven't had electricity for 2 days, and they want to do something about it. You cannot leave it to NGOs to NGOize this segment of frustration and to dilute this, what I would consider the revolutionary stirrings of people to survive in the world, to dilute it into NGO service delivery. This is an important space to build a left at a global level. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Imperialism and the global left. Imperialism today is not your great-grandparents' imperialism. That doesn't mean you don't read Lenin. It doesn't mean that the essence of what I'm talking about is different from Lenin. It means that capitalism is a dynamic entity. Its understanding of accumulation is shifting. It's not, doesn't have no movement. It's in motion at all times. Why does the workers' movement have to be stopped and only follow an old strategy? We have to have our own strategy. We have to soberly inspect where opportunities are to build worker power. Because the road to socialism is the building of worker confidence and worker power. And that's how we're going to rebuild a global left. Thanks a lot.